Food number 2 is refined carbs, and we really need to understand what those are because they usually only make a big deal out of added sugar. And we all know to look at the label, and if it has added sugar, we stay away from it. But added sugar, that's the white sugar, the crystals, but it also in any other form like honey or glucose syrup or agave or high fructose corn syrup or any of those. And what they're adding is basically a sugar that consists of a glucose molecule that is tied to a fructose molecule. And these are both, they're monosaccharides, meaning single, and we put them together like in white table sugar, then it becomes a disaccharide. And this is what we're talking about with added sugar. And why is this so bad? Because the glucose portion of it will raise blood sugar, and because these carbs are processed, then they're going to break apart very quickly, and the glucose will raise blood sugar. The fructose will take a different path. It's not called blood sugar because it's not blood glucose. This is fructose. And that has to go through the liver to get processed. And in doing that, it causes fatty liver. It is almost on par with alcohol in how bad and how quickly it causes a fatty liver. And of course, alcohol is bad because it causes an intoxication, but at the same time, that sort of sets a limit for how much alcohol people consume. Sugar doesn't do that, so there's no limit in how much people eat. And therefore, we also give it to kids, and kids now can get fatty liver at a very, very early age. So we all know to stay away from that. However, there is also something called natural sugar. So when that occurs in fruit, it's okay to have some berries. It's okay to have fruit occasionally if you're not insulin resistant or you don't have type 2 diabetes. But when they dry the fruit, then sometimes they add chemicals to it, sometimes they even add sugar to it, and now it becomes a very concentrated form of sugar. Like raisins is about 70% pure sugar, just like that. The other form is when we make juice out of it, because now we remove the pulp, we remove the fiber, we remove all the cell walls, the bulk of that fruit, and now it just becomes a liquid with sugar floating around in it. And that natural sugar is no different. It's exactly the same as the added sugar. So even if they don't list it on the label, we need to understand the difference, that there really is no difference. We need to understand that sugar is sugar. And then there's one more kind of carbohydrate called starch. And if we get a little bit here and there in a sweet potato or some tubers, that's not a big deal. But when we get it in grain, we're getting way too much. And we're getting it in processed grains. Now we removed a lot of the fiber, everything that slows it down. So now that starch raises blood glucose even faster than the sugar does. And starch is nothing more, nothing less than these little sugar molecules. And then when we link them together, 2, 3, and dozens, and hundreds, and thousands, now that's called a starch. But it's still only one type of molecule. And then we go, when we eat these, we have something called amylase in the mouth, and that starts chopping off these little glucose molecules the moment we get them in our mouth. So within minutes, we see a rise in glucose, in blood glucose from eating starch. And like I said, this is faster even than sugar. And the reason that we want to understand this so well and avoid excess carbohydrate, whatever level that is for you and your lifestyle and your genetic makeup, is that there's such a strong connection between glucose and insulin resistance and dementia that it's sometimes called type 3 diabetes. And that doesn't mean that it is a separate type of diabetes. It just means they're trying to focus and help us understand how strong that link is. And to understand the link and that mechanism, we need to understand the two types of fuel that the brain can use. And very often they talk about only glucose. If you do a Google search on fuels for the brain, the first million hits are going to be for glucose alone. And if you talk to 99% of doctors, they're going to tell you that the brain can only use glucose. But ketones have been critical in human survival, and it's critical in babies. Babies are born into ketosis, and that helps drive that huge brain. So when we eat a lot of sugar and we eat a lot of starch, now we raise blood glucose. We get excess blood glucose on a regular basis. And if we get excess glucose, we get excess insulin. If we do that all the time, we become insulin resistant. And here's something that was not discovered until very recently, really, like 50 years ago. They had no idea, because we thought back then that the brain was so dependent on glucose that it could just suck it up out of the bloodstream, that you didn't need insulin to get the glucose into the brain. Well, that proved to be wrong, because the brain does depend on insulin. So if your cells are insulin resistant, if your muscles are insulin resistant, then your whole body also becomes insulin resistant to some degree, and your brain cells are insulin resistant. So for a given level of blood sugar, that means if your brain is insulin resistant, it gets less glucose. It can't properly get into those brain cells. So here is that paradox that is responsible for dementia in people with insulin resistance. And that is that if you have too high a blood glucose, then that results in less glucose in the brain. So the more sugar you eat, the more your brain starves. And some people would look at that and say, oh, well, the body is pretty stupid sometimes. That seems like a defective design. And I would beg to differ. I would say that it's a defective lifestyle, that we have introduced something in the last 50 years, 50 to 100 years, that humans have never ever seen before. We have never had the abundance of sugar and starch, especially processed starch, that we've had in the last few decades.